What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that's both fast-paced and entertaining. As Season 1 continues, we wanted to take some decks that we know well and are some of our favorites, and mix them with some decks that are maybe a little less conventional. Before we get started though, I do have a few quick channel promotions. First off, if you like what we do here and you want to help support us financially, we have a Patreon, link in the description, and this money allows us to afford upgrades to our setup and continue to improve the quality of our videos. We believe we have a nice set of rewards that will make it worth your time if that's something you're interested in. Secondly, we have a Discord. If you want to talk to us or just be part of the community, link for that as well is in the description. And lastly, if you're looking to buy cards, we now have a TCG affiliate link in the description, so go ahead and click on that if you do want to support us while you're also buying cards. With the self-promotion out of the way, let's get into the opening hands and the gameplay. Up first today, we have Bill playing Inalla Archmage Ritualist. This deck, which I personally like to call Grixis Hulk, is a very interesting deck. It relies on Spellseeker and Inalla's Eminence ability in order to just tutor up a very specific line of cards to generate usually infinite mana and infinite hasty wizards. It's a very unique deck, and if you're looking for the full combo line, link to the deck list is in the description. Bill's opening hand contained an Island, a Flooded Strand, a Lotus Petal, a Swan Song, a Dispel, a Mindblade Render, and a Frantic Search. Up next, we have Joseph playing Ruric Thar the Unbowed. Now, full disclosure, this is a pretty stacksy deck, with the main goals being to ramp out quickly, slow down the board with restrictive and what I like to call aggressive stacks, like Ruric Thar's own ability to deal 6 damage when someone casts a non-creature spell, and eventually win through either a Kiki-Jiki combo or dumping a lot of mana into Finale of Devastation, swinging out and winning through combat damage. The 7 cards in his opening hand were a City of Brass, a Mountain, a Mana Vault, a Cinder Vines, a Sylvan Library, a Force of Vigor, and a Tooth and Nail. Going third today, we have Adam playing Brago, King Eternal. This pseudo-stacks deck looks to slow down and control the board while taking advantage of Brago's ability to blink permanents in and out, and eventually winning through either a Stronic Resonator, allowing him to get infinite blinks off of his permanents, or through a Helm of Obedience Rest in Peace combo, milling everyone out. His opening hand contained a Snow-Covered Island, a Command Tower, an Enlightened Tutor, a Mox Opal, an Oath of Jace, a Shimmer Myr, and a Force of Will. And finally, we have Nate playing Crick, son of Yawgmoth. This mono-black Storm deck, that's not something I say often, looks to use Doomsday as pretty much just a super tutor in order to assemble one of his Storm-based combos and then eventually win through Aetherflux Reservoir. This is enabled by Crick's ability to pay life into mana abilities, so he can cast specific spells like Leshrak's Sigil over and over again, eventually netting life through Aetherflux Reservoir. His opening hand today contained an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, a Strip Mine, a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, a Castle Lochthwain, a Zurin Orb, a Blood Pet, and a Fade from Memory. Now with the opening hands out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Bill starts us off today by drawing and playing a Flooded Strand as his land for turn, immediately paying 1 life to crack it, to search up a Steam Vents and having it enter untapped, dealing 2 more damage to himself. He then casts a Lotus Petal for 0 mana, and then taps his Steam Vents and cracks his Lotus Petal, producing a black, to cast a Mindblade Render. With nothing else, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws and plays a Mountain as his land for turn, immediately tapping it to cast a Mana Vault. With nothing left, he passes the turn over to Adam. Adam draws and plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and decides to give the turn to Nate. Nate draws and plays an Urborg as his land for turn. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Zurin Orb. He then taps his Urborg to cast a Blood Pet. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and goes to combat, swinging the Mindblade Render at Adam. Adam declares no blockers, takes 1 damage, and then Bill loses 1 life and draws a card due to Renderer's ability. He then plays a Reflecting Pool as his land for turn, and decides to pass the turn over to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a City of Brass as his land for turn. He then taps this City of Brass along with his Mountain to cast a Sylvan Library. In response to this, Bill taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Swan Song, attempting to stop Joseph's value. It works, Sylvan Library is countered, and Joseph then goes to pass the turn to Adam. On Joseph's end step, Adam taps his Command Tower for a white mana to cast an Enlightened Tutor. It resolves, and he searches up a Mana Crypt to the top of his library. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, and then, for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. He then taps for 4 mana to cast his commander, Brago, King Eternal. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Castle Lochthwain as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Cabal Ritual. When it resolves, getting 3 black mana to his mana pool. He then sacks his Blood Pet for a black, and then pays 6 life for Phyrexian mana to cast his commander, Crick, son of Yawgmoth. It resolves, and he then passes the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays an island as his land for turn, and he then taps for 3 mana to cast a Frantic Search. And as it resolves, he draws 2 cards, discards 2 cards, and then untaps 3 lands. He then decides to pass the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a mountain as his land for turn. He then taps his City of Brass as well as a mountain in order to cast a Cindervines. It resolves, and he then taps for 1 red mana to cast an Orcish Lumberjack. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, and in his upkeep, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, and taps for enough mana to cast an Oath of Jace. The Cindervines triggers off of this, dealing 1 damage to Adam, and then in response to the initial cast, Nate cycles his Fade from Memory, paying 2 life for the mana cost due to Crick's ability. Oath of Jace then resolves, and Adam decides to play a Snow-Covered Plains as his land for turn. He then goes to combat and swings Brago at Nate. He declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and as he deals combat damage, Adam decides to blink his Mana Crypt, his Brago, and his Oath of Jace, allowing Adam to draw 3 more cards, discard 2, and then essentially untapping his permanents. He then taps his mana to cast a Grasp of Fate. As it enters the battlefield, he targets Crick from Nate, Mindblade Render from Bill, and Mana Fault from Joseph as the targets to exile. Those cards are then exiled. Nate decides to put Crick back into the command zone, and then Adam passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 black mana, including tapping Nykthos for a black since Urborg is on the battlefield, to cast a Necropotence. The Cindervines triggers off of this, dealing 1 damage to Nate, and when it resolves, he pays 4 life to exile 4 cards face down, and then goes to his end step, putting those cards to his hand. The turn is then passed to Bill. On his turn, Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Wheel of Fortune. The Cindervines triggers in response to this, dealing 1 damage to Bill, and in response to the wheel, Joseph exiles Growing Rites of Ithelmach from his hand to cast a Force of Vigor without paying its mana cost, targeting Grasp of Fate and Oath of Jace. The Force of Vigor resolves, everyone gets their permanents back, including Nate, who gets his commander back due to how Grasp of Fate is worded. Even if you put your commander back in the command zone, it still does come back when this enchantment is destroyed. And then the Wheel of Fortune resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7 more. With nothing left, Bill passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and as it enters the battlefield, he names Ogre. He then taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Ruric Thar the Unbowed, who, since he's an Ogre, is uncounterable. In response to the cast, not wanting to take 7 damage for this play, Bill taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Brainstorm, taking 1 damage from Cindervines, and then drawing 3 cards, putting 2 back on top, and then Ruric Thar hits the battlefield. Joseph then goes to combat and swings his 2/2 bird at Bill, who declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and then Joseph gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then draws, and plays a Nimbus Maze as his land for turn. He then goes to combat and swings Brago at Bill, who declares no blockers, deals 2 damage, and as he does combat damage, Adam decides to just blink Brago since it's his only tapped permanent, and he then decides to pass the turn to Nate. On Adam's end step, Nate pays 4 life to cast a Victim of Night, targeting Ruric Thar. On cast, he takes 1 damage from Cindervines, 6 from Ruric Thar, and with no responses, it then resolves, killing Ruric Thar, and triggering Crick, putting a +1/+1 counter on him since he cast a black spell. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He then pays to activate Nykthos, generating 6 black mana. He uses this mana to help cast a Fate Unraveler. Crick triggers off of this, adding another +1/+1 counter, and in response to this, Adam taps for 1 mana to cast Brainstorm, taking 1 damage from Cindervines, and then drawing 3 cards, putting 2 back on top, and then the Fate Unraveler finally resolves. Nate then uses another one of his floating black mana to cast a Mana Vault, taking 1 damage from Cindervines, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Darksteel Ingot, taking another damage from Cindervines. He then pays 4 life using Crick's ability to pay for the black mana cost of a Leyline of the Void, paying for the rest of it with his floating black mana and using Darksteel Ingot. He takes 1 more damage from Cindervines, and on cast, Crick triggers, putting another +1/+1 counter on him, and then the Leyline resolves. He then goes to combat and swings Crick at Bill, who chump blocks with his Mindblade Render, and due to the lifelink and the +1/+1 counters, Nate then gains 5 life. He then plays a Lake of the Dead as his land for turn, and sacrifices Castle Lochthwain as it enters the battlefield, since the castle is now a swamp due to Urborg, and then pays 3 life into Necropons to exile 3 cards, and then goes to his end step, putting those cards into his hand. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and when he draws, Fate Unraveler does 1 damage to him. He then plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. With nothing else, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped. He then draws his card and takes 1 damage from Fate Unraveler. He then plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn, immediately paying 1 life to crack it to search up a card to the battlefield. However, in response to this activation, Adam taps for 3 mana to cast an Aven Mind Sensor. The Aven Mind Sensor resolves, and Joseph then crosses his fingers and looks at the top 4 cards of his library, looking for a mountain. He unfortunately fails to find, shuffles his library, and then taps for 1 red mana to cast a Faithless Looting. It resolves, he draws 2 cards, takes 2 damage from Fate Unraveler, and then discards 2 cards. He then taps for enough mana to cast a Damping Sphere. Not wanting this to affect his turn too much, Bill taps for 2 mana to cast a Delay, targeting Dampening Sphere, taking 1 damage from Cindervines as it's cast. In response to this, Joseph taps his City of Brass, taking 1 damage to produce a red mana to cast a Pyroblast, targeting the Delay. As priorities get around, Nate decides to get in on the action and pays 2 life using Crick's ability and taps for 1 additional mana to cast an Imp's Mischief, targeting the Pyroblast and changing the target to Brago. He takes 1 damage from Cindervines on cast, and in response to this, not wanting to lose his commander, Adam pays 2 life to cast a Mental Misstep, countering the Pyroblast. He takes 1 damage from Cindervines as it's cast, and the stack then resolves. Now you may notice there is a bit of a misplay here. Imp's Mischief isn't able to change the mode Pyroblast has chosen, and the mode was to counter target spell if it's blue. So since it can't change the mode to destroy target permanent, it's not actually able to destroy our target Brago. However, Imp's Mischief is able to change the target of Pyroblast to Damping Sphere, for example. Even though Damping Sphere isn't a blue spell, Pyroblast doesn't check the spell color that it's targeting until it resolves. So Damping Sphere is legally countered. For the sake of consistency, we are going to play it out as if the Mental Misstep had countered the Pyroblast, so Adam will lose the card and the life. However, other than this card disadvantage, this misplay has no real major or game-changing impact on this game. We really just wanted to mention it for transparency's sake. Anyway, with this stack now resolved, Joseph exiles the Damping Sphere, putting 3 suspend counters on it, and then goes to combat and swings his 2/2 bird at Nate in the air, who declares no blockers and takes 2 damage. Joseph then passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and takes 1 damage from Fate Unraveler. He then, in his first main phase, taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Preordain, taking 1 damage from Cindervines, and when it resolves, puts 1 card on the top, 1 on the bottom, draws a card, and takes another damage from Fate Unraveler. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Prismatic Lens, taking another damage from Cindervines. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Prophetic Prism, taking another damage from Cindervines, and then it resolves, he draws a card, and takes a damage from Fate Unraveler. He then goes to combat and swings both Aven Mind Sensor and Brago at Nate. In response to the declare attacks, Nate activates Zurin Orb, sacrificing his Lake of the Dead in order to gain 2 life, and he then declares no blockers, takes 4 damage, and Brago then triggers, and Adam decides to blink his creatures as well as his artifacts in order to draw a card off of the Prophetic Prism, and then untap his creatures. He takes 1 more damage from Fate Unraveler when he draws the card off of the blink, and then in his second main phase, taps for 2 white mana to cast a Grand Abolisher. Nobody has any responses, Grand Abolisher resolves, and Adam then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and skips his draw step due to Necropons, and then goes to combat, swinging Crick at Adam. In response to this, Adam taps for 2 mana to cast a single targeted Cyclonic Rift targeting Crick. On cast, Adam takes 1 damage from Cindervines, and then Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing Crick to Nate's hand. In his second main phase, Nate decides to activate Nykthos Shrine to Nyx in order to generate 6 black mana. He then sacrifices Nykthos to Zurin Orb, gaining 2 life, and then uses 4 of his black mana to cast a Damnation. He takes 1 damage from Cindervines on cast, Damnation resolves, and he then pays 2 life into Necropotence. He then goes to pass the turn to Bill. On Nate's end step, Bill taps for 3 mana to Wizard Cycle his Vidalcan Aethermage, searching up a Spellseeker to his hand. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and shocks in a Watery Grave as his land for turn, taking 2 damage. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Narset Parter of Veils on cast, taking 1 damage from Cindervines, and upon resolution, uses her minus ability to look at the top 4 cards of his library and puts a Windfall into his hand. He then passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and in his upkeep removes 1 suspend counter from Damping Sphere. He then goes to his draw step and takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then draws his card for turn. He then plays a Forest as his land for turn. He then taps for 1 green mana to cast a Birds of Paradise. He then taps the City of Brass, taking a damage to generate another green to cast an Elvish Mystic. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 more damage. He then draws and plays a tapped Irrigated Farmlands as his land for turn. He then taps for 6 mana to cast a Reshape X equaling 4 and sacking his Prophetic Prism as an additional cost. He takes 1 damage from Cindervines, and then in response to the initial cast, Bill taps for 1 red mana to cast a red Elemental Blast, targeting Reshape and taking a damage from Cindervines. Reshape is countered, and Adam then pays 1 mana to play a Sensei's Divining Top, taking 1 more damage from Cindervines. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and sacrifices 1 of his lands to Zurin Orb to gain 2 life. He then pays 2 life into Necropotence, exiling 2 cards face down, and then moves to his end step, putting those cards to his hand and passing the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and taps for 3 mana to cast a Spellseeker. In response, Adam taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card and put Sensei's back on top of his library, and then Spellseeker resolves. When it enters the battlefield, he pays 1 mana for Inalla's ability to create a copy of it with haste. When the copy enters the battlefield, he tutors up an Essence Flux to his hand. And then as the initial Spellseeker resolves, he tutors up a Culling the Weak to his hand. He then goes to combat and swings the hasty Spellseeker copy at Nate. Nate declares no blockers and then dies to combat damage. With his graveyard now enabled, Bill happily passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped in his draw step. He then draws and then pays 6 mana, taking 1 damage from City of Brass, to cast a Finale of Devastation, X equaling 4. It resolves, and he searches up a Treasonous Ogre to the battlefield. Knowing that Bill is 1 turn away from victory, he pays 21 life into Treasonous Ogre to help recast Ruric Thar. Ruric Thar resolves, and Joseph then passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, and taps for 6 mana to recast his commander, not taking any damage from either Cindervines or from Ruric Thar. Adam then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays 1 blue mana to cast an Essence Flux. He targets the Spellseeker, and when it resolves, uses the ETB of the Spellseeker to search up a Snap to his hand. He then pays for the Inalla trigger, and when the copy enters the battlefield, he searches up a Chain of Vapor to his hand. He then taps for 2 mana to cast Snap on Ruric Thar, taking another 7 damage from Cindervines and from Ruric Thar. It resolves, Ruric Thar is bounced, and Bill then untaps 2 lands. He then taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Chain of Vapor targeting Cindervines. He takes 1 damage from Cindervines, and then Cindervines is bounced. Joseph decides to sacrifice 1 of his lands to get his own copy of Chain of Vapor and targets the Spellseeker. In response to this copy Chain of Vapor, Bill taps for 1 black mana to cast Culling the Weak, sacrificing the Spellseeker as an additional cost. It resolves, and he floats 4 black mana. The copy Chain of Vapor then fizzles since it has no targets, and for the sake of simplicity, since both Adam and Joseph know it's over at this point, they let Bill know that they don't really have any interaction, and then Bill takes out his 12-page essay to show us his loop. He starts off by using one of his floating black mana to cast Unearth, targeting the Spellseeker in his graveyard. It resolves, and as it enters the battlefield, he pays another of the floating black for the Inalla trigger. With the 2 ETB effects, he tutors up a Reanimate and an Entomb to his hand. He then uses another one of his floating black to cast his Entomb, searching up a Scholar of the Ages to his graveyard. He then uses his last floating black mana to cast Reanimate, targeting this Scholar. He takes 7 damage as it enters the battlefield, and then he taps one of his lands to pay for the Inalla trigger. As the copy enters the battlefield, he returns Culling the Weak and Unearth to his hand, and as the original one enters the battlefield, he returns a Finale of Promise and an Entomb to his hand. He then taps his last land for a black mana to recast his Culling the Weak, targeting his Spellseeker. He floats 4 black mana, sacrifices it as an additional cost, and then uses one of this black mana to cast Unearth, targeting the Spellseeker. He then uses another one of his floating mana to pay for Inalla's ability, making another copy. As both enter the battlefield, he searches up a Burnt Offering and a Shallow Grave to his hand. He then uses his floating black mana to cast a Burnt Offering, targeting the Scholar of Ages, floating 7 black mana. He then performs a loop of casting Burnt Offering on Scholar of Ages to float mana, and then return it to the battlefield with Shallow Grave, paying for the Inalla trigger, and then returning both these instant spells, one with the original and one with the copy. He then repeats this loop to generate enough mana, paying for the Inalla trigger each time to generate an infinite amount of hasty Scholar of the Ages, and then going to combat and swinging 10,000 Scholars at Joseph and 10,000 at Adam, and since they aren't able to block enough of the damage, both take lethal damage, and Bill wins the game. First off, I know what you're thinking. If Adam had that mental misstep, he could have countered one of the 1 CMC spells that Bill had cast, and since Bill didn't have any mana left up, it's highly unlikely he would have been able to finish his combo turn. However, we did end up checking after the game, and Bill was holding on to a free counter spell for his combo turn just in case, so it would have ended up working out with the same outcome. We do sincerely apologize for these misplays. We play a lot of games, and we try to catch everything we can, but sometimes some things do slip by us. The biggest thing for us is that none of these misplays ever affect the outcome of the game, and if they do, we will either not release them or we will pull them down when it's realized. So we do apologize, but fortunately, the outcome of the game would have remained the same. Anyway, with that all out of the way, let's get into the post-game recap. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this game very interesting because it featured a lot of commanders that probably aren't normally seen at either a semi-competitive or a competitive table. These decks are really interesting on their own, and when put together, I think it makes up for a very interesting game. As a little post-game recap, I do want to hit quickly on what I would consider the most valuable card for this game, and then I have a few points to talk about after that. First off, for the most valuable card, I have to give it to Cindervines. Cindervines, for such a cheap and normally inconsequential card, put in a lot of work this game by just constantly pinging and threatening and holding people off from going infinite because it just existed and was there. Normally this 1 damage isn't really that much of a deal in Commander, but in this game specifically, where there was a lot of grindy aspects and there was a lot of just stalling and building board states, it put in quite a bit of work, and really for such a small amount of investment in terms of casting cost, it really did a lot and had a very large impact. To continue the post-game recap, I want to talk about a situation in the game that I think may have been missed that I found very interesting while playing this game. And the situation was Adam's ability to kind of read his opponents and use his opponent's permanents against them in order to try to sneak out a quick win. Now, it may not have been very clear at the time, but Reshape X equaling 4 would have gotten him a Helm of Obedience to the battlefield, and with Brago, he could have blinked it and activated it twice on his turn, milling out both Joseph and Bill, and then swung for lethal damage at Nate. I think at that point, Nate was within lethal range, and he could have won the game due to someone else's graveyard hate. Now, it wouldn't have been guaranteed since Cindervines could have killed the Leyline before Joseph died, but if Adam did have a way to untap Helm or respond to the Cindervines trigger, it definitely could have worked. However, that is all we have for you today. Remember to vote for your favorite commander using the little eye icon on the top right of this video to let us know who you want to see in the Season 1 consolation match. Remember, if you do want to help support this channel to improve our quality, we do have a Patreon, link is in the description, and if you want to talk to us or just be part of the community, follow our Twitter or join our Discord. Those are available for you as well in the description. Check out the deck lists if you're interested in specific combo lines or card choices, but other than that, that is all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed this video. Again, I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.